Hello, friends. Welcome back to another episode of the William Bonney Weekly Podcast. Today we're profiling a prison. Again, one of the more infamous ones around the country, synonymous with the riots that took place in 1990, the country's longest rooftop riot that happened in, 1990, basically down to the conditions that were in the prison at the time. So we're having a look today at HMP Strangeways, now known as HMP Manchester, as part of its rebranding after the prisoners took the prison and caused all that damage. So, yeah, sit down, relax, grab yourself a drink, and let's see what we've got for you. So, HMP Manchester is a Category A and B men's prison in Manchester, operated by HMP Service. It's commonly referred to as Strangeways still, which was its former official name, which is again derived from the area which it's located. It was rebuilt after a major riot in 1990. It's a local prison, which means it holds remand prisoners sent into custody from the Manchester area, and Category A prisoners, those who are held under maximum security conditions. The prison is basically one of the only prisons to have a full-time execution chamber. Obviously, that was abolished in 1960s, but the last execution that took place there was 1964. So a lot of places had kind of, execution chambers where they would hang people, but this one, it was the only one that had a, one that was there, made especially, and was always there for hanging people and capital punishment. Strangeways was designed by a chap called Alfred Waterhouse and opened in 1868. The prison is known for its prominent ventilation tower and imposing design. So it was again another one of these Victorian prisons that was supposed to be built to look like a fort, big tall buildings. And the way that the prison's built again is in the Victorian style of basically like a cartwheel. So you'll have one central office in the middle, and then you've got about 5 or 6 spurs all going off, or wings going off in different directions. So that again, notably, someone can stand in the middle and you'd be able to see down all of the wings. Now, obviously, let's get to the most interesting thing about the prison is the riots. So a lot of people, if you don't know, the riots took place in the 90s. It was essentially because of the conditions that prisoners were living in at the time. A lot of prisons before the year 2000 essentially were in slop-out conditions. I know when I went to Exeter, first of all, the wing I was on was still slop out. So you'd have a bucket in your cell. I had a cellmate as well. So the two of you would be expected to use that bucket sort of overnight and when you're locked up. Prisons are overcrowded these days. The prison was originally designed to have something like 900 inmates. It currently has about 1,200. And it's basically, they just, they put 2 and 3 men in a cell with a bucket, and you're told to get on with it. Now, obviously, there isn't enough jobs in the prison, so everyone's sort of stuck in their cell. There isn't enough meaningful activity, and there aren't enough staff to have everyone out all the time. So, you've got 2 or 3 men in a cell using a bucket and getting really upset. So, let's have a look at the riot first. So, the 1990 Strangeways riot was a 25-day prison riot and rooftop protest at Strangeways Prison. The riot began on April 1st, 1990. When the prisoners took control of the prison chapel, and it quickly spread throughout most of the prison. The incident ended on April 25th, when the final 5 prisoners were removed from the rooftop. 1 prisoner was killed during the riot, and 147 officers and 47 prisoners were injured. Much of the prison was damaged or destroyed, with the cost of repairs coming to £55 million. Now, bearing in mind, it only cost about $5 million to build the prison. They managed to do £55 million worth of damage. The equivalent to 133 million in today's money. Jeez. It was the longest prison riot in British penal history. The riot was followed by a series of disturbances across the prison estate in England, Scotland and Wales, resulting in the British government announcing a public inquiry into the riots headed by Lord Wolfe. The Wolfe report concluded that conditions in the prison had been intolerable and recommended major reform across the UK prison system. So, yeah, it was just the awful conditions. It was one of those kind of prisons. I've seen a documentary about it, and it was the staff kind of just, it worked off discipline. So it's one of these old school prisons, which a lot of people kind of want. When you think of prison, you think of locking people up and throwing away the key in a dirty little cell. And that was the reality of what a lot of the prisons were like across the UK. Remember, we had a conservative government through a lot of this time. We had, through the 70s and 80s, 90s, we had, recession. So nobody in their right mind was going to be throwing money at the prison system to make life better for them. So, the prison system was what broke first. So Strangeways Prison, which opened in Manchester in 1868, was a local prison designed to hold local people. At the time of the riot, the main prison consisted of 6 wings connected by a central rotunda known as a centra. Convicted adult prisoners were held in A, B, C, and D. Convicted young offenders were held in E wing, which was physically separated by the centre gates. Convicted prisoners on Rule 43 were held on landings C1 and C2 of C wing, and remand prisoners on Rule 43 were on the 4th landing on E wing. Now, for those of you that don't know, Rule 43 is basically the segregation rule. It's the rule that says that you'll be looked after and protected if you choose to do that. Amongst inmates, it's known as going on the rule. It's basically protection. Nonces, paedophiles, politicians, those sort of scumbags, grasses, police. Anyone who goes in who wants to be put on protection is basically going on Rule 43. F wing contained administrative offices on the lower floor and the chapel on the upper floor. Remand prisoners were held on wings G, H, I, and K of a separate prison, linked through the main prison through workshops and a kitchen. The certified normal accommodation for Strangeways, the number of prisoners at the prison, was designed to hold 970, but the population of the prison had increased in the months before the riot from 1,400 in 1990 up to its peak of 1,658 on the 27th of March. So, you're looking at getting twice as many prisoners in that same spot, and you just can't do that. On April the 1st, the prison contained 1,647 prisoners, about 920 convicted adult prisoners, 500 remand, and 270 convicted young offenders. Prisoners felt their complaints about conditions were being ignored. Remand prisoners were only allowed out of their cells for 18 hours per week, and the Category A prisoners were locked in their cell for 22 hours a day and rarely left their cells except for slopping out. A 1-hour exercise period each day, or a weekly shower. So that's the basics of what they have to give you, and it's pretty much the same now. So the staff will tell you you're actually entitled to one sort of shower period a week. You're allowed exercise for 1 hour a day. Obviously allowed out for meal times, but you have to eat them in your cell. And only one gym session a week is what you're actually entitled to. So everything else is kind of discretionary. A lot of prisons run a much better regime than that, and obviously they've changed a lot since then. But that's what the staff will tell you. So they'll say, if you're on basic, or if you mess around, then they don't have to give you anything other than that. So let's have a look. In March 1990, Dominic Noonan was transferred from Strangeways to HMP Hull. Noonan was the organiser of the Prisoners League Association, the PLA. I bet that went down well. The organisation formed in 1989, which campaigned for prisoners' rights. Its aims included initiating legal proceedings against prison staff for mistreatment of prisoners and picketing outside prisons where prisoners were mistreated. The PLA were active at Strangeways, and Noonan's transfer demonstrated the prison officers were aware of rising tensions inside the prison. On March 26, 1990, Barry Morton was taken to the punishment block and strip searched after being visited by his mother, as prison officers believed she had brought in drugs into the prison for him. During a struggle, he sustained a black eye and a swollen nose, and the following day he was released back into the main prison, along with another prisoner, Tony Bush. Later the same day, Morton and Bush climbed onto the roof of the prison and staged a 24-hour rooftop protest. On March 31st, there was a 30-minute sit-down protest in the chapel after a film was shown, which ended after the prison officer promised to listen to the previous prisoner's grievances. The same evening, it was reported that a black prisoner was assaulted by a prison officer in front of other prisoners and injected with a sedative used to control prisoners, known as a liquid cosh. Prisoners then decided to stage a further protest at the chapel. So from the interviews I've seen with these the prisoners that organised the riots, essentially, and as I've mentioned in other videos, the prison chapel is one of the few places where prisoners from different wings get to meet up, because there's only a limited number of actual Catholics in the prison. So what they do is they'll normally on a Saturday, you'll get to go to chapel, and it's a place for prisoners to come meet, really, and have a chat with a mate from another wing. But they decided to do, again, another peaceful protest where they basically just sit down and they just, they were going to just be obnoxious. Now, I've seen sit-down protests before. I was back in 2005. I was in Exeter, and just before I got there, they'd had the hottest day of the year. I remember being out for that day, but they'd had the hottest day of the year, and obviously in Exeter, it's again 23-hour bang up. This is 1 hour a day out your cell is all you get. So the inmates refused to go back because of the limited access to outside and breeze. And it quickly, the staff quickly lock everybody up, and then they drag everyone back in, and it's all over. So your grievances don't always get listened to by doing these sort of things. So the disturbance in the chapel, prison officers had advance warning that an incident would occur. Fucking snitches. On the chapel, April 1st, security was increased. Extra prison officers were used to escort the prisoners to the service, and 14 officers were inside the chapel supervising the service instead of the usual 8. An additional 7 officers were also stationed at the vestry outside the chapel. The service was attended by 309 prisoners. So you can imagine that's a lot. You don't get church services out here with 309 people, let alone doing that with a prison, which is about the usual attendance, but all but the Rule 43, who were prevented from attending as a precautionary measure, because obviously the minute it kicks off, the nonces get it straight away. A senior prison officer believed the prisoners would attempt another sit-down protest with the possibility of hostage-taking, and instructed staff to evacuate the chapel if trouble began. At approximately 11 a.m., a visiting Anglican minister had just delivered the sermon, and the prison chaplain, Noel Proctor, stood to thank him when the prisoner Paul Taylor took the microphone from him and addressed the congregation. The Reverend Proctor was recording the service for distribution to a prayer group, and the subsequent events were recorded. Noel Proctor, the minister, says, after that remarkable message that has, and then he's cut short, Paul Taylor takes over, basically saying, I would like to say, right, that this man has just talked about blessing of the heart, and a hardened heart can be delivered. No, it cannot. Not with resentment, anger, and bitterness and hatred being installed in people. Then there's a general noise over which a prisoner can be heard. Fuck your system, fuck your rules. And then there's applause. Noel Proctor, the chaplain, comes forward. Right, lads, sit down. There's more noise. Noel Proctor again. Right, lads, down, down. Come on, this is no way to carry on in God's house. There's more noise. There's another prisoner comes forward. Fuck your system. There's more noise. Proctor says, right, lads, sit down. This is completely out of order. Sit down. Another prisoner is, why is it? It's been waiting to happen forever. It will never change. Proctor again. Come on, this is terrible. There's more noise, banging, shouting and cheering. Noel Proctor again. All of you who want to go back to your cells, go back out of the church, please. Prisoner. What? You fucking hypocrite, you. Noel Proctor again. I'm trying to help you, to keep you. A prisoner says, leave it, mate. And then there's more noise until the microphone goes dead. So as Proctor was appealing for calm, a prisoner brandishes 2 sticks and shouts out, you've heard enough. Let's do it. Let's get the bastards. Other prisoners responded by donning masks and brandishing weapons, and 3 prison officers started to leave the chapel as earlier instructed. A set of keys was taken from a prison officer when a number of officers were attacked by prisoners wielding fire extinguishers, table legs, and fire buckets. A number of prisoners attempted to leave the chapel via the vestry. At the same time, the 7 prison officers attempted to gain entry to the chapel. Once they managed to do so, the officers were attacked by the prisoners, and a second set of keys was taken from them. Some prisoners helped to get Proctor and the injured officers to a place of safety via the vestry, while others barricaded the entrances to the chapel or attempted to get access to the roof. So the violence pretty much spreads then. So like in any society, there is always more of us than there is them. And prison is a society in itself. You know, when you've got 1,200 inmates, I think it was more than that, wasn't it? It was about 1,600 inmates, and at best 100 members of staff on any day. I think you can tell then that, you know, they're just relying on the prisoners behaving, and as soon as it tips that balance, then the prisoners are vastly outnumber the staff. The prison officers guarding the gates outside the chapel abandoned them and ran towards the centre. The prison officer in charge of the centre saw his colleagues running from the direction of the chapel, but due to the presence of scaffolding, he was in a poor position to view the upper levels and mistakenly assumed he saw prisoners running from the chapel. He informed the officers on C1 and D1 of this, and upon hearing that the prisoners were in possession of keys, told them and the officers on A1 that they should evacuate the prison. Governor Morrison, who was responsible for the main prison, then ordered officers to evacuate the centre at 11:13 a.m. He had mistakenly believed that prisoners had entered the centre. By this time, prisoners had gained access to the roof on E and F wing, and from there, they were able to gain access to the other wings by making holes in the unprotected ceilings. Prison officers found A and B wings unsupervised, as the prison officers had already evacuated, and began to free other prisoners who were still locked in their cells. The prison officer in charge of the first landing on C wing was ordered to evacuate, and with the help of 3 other officers, evacuated 73 Rule 43 prisoners who were being held there, being fearful for the safety of the prisoners who were regarded as sex offenders. Due to the rioting prisoners entering the wing, the officers were unable to evacuate a further 7 Rule 43 prisoners who were being held on the second landing. Rioting prisoners also gained access to E-wing, where the Rule 43 prisoners had been left locked in their cells after the prison officers evacuated. A number of these nonce inmates were attacked by rioting prisoners. One such prisoner was Derek White, who was being held on remand for charges of indecent assault and buggery. White later died in North Manchester Hospital after being admitted suffering from head wounds and a dislocated shoulder and chest pains. At 11:43, rioting prisoners were seen approaching the remand prison, which was still secure. The prison governor, Brendan O'Friel, arrived at the prison at 11:55 and gave orders to defend the remand prison. Rioting prisoners gained access to the remand prison at 12:20 p.m. through the kitchens in G-Wing and began freeing prisoners who were still locked in their cells using stolen keys or improvised tools such as iron bars and fire extinguishers. At this point, the rioting prisons were in control of all the accommodation wings in the prison now. A large number of prisoners were on the roof, and roof tiles and other missiles were being thrown down at prison officers on the ground. It always makes me laugh when they say missiles, because I imagine those kind of missiles that you see flying off the back of trucks and stuff, you know, like the bombs. They were throwing missiles. Who gives the prisoners missiles? Rioting inside the prison continued, with cells being damaged and fires being started. At 3:40 p.m., the Public Relations Department of the Home Office issued a statement. So it started at about 11 down the chapel, and we're now looking at 3:40. So we've been going on for about 4.5 hours, something like that. Oh, and funnily enough, that's what the issued statement said. At 11 a.m., a disturbance started in the chapel at Strangeways prison, where some 300 prisoners attacked staff. Those prisoners then gained access to the chapel roof and then broke into the living accommodation in the main prison. Other prisoners, including those on remand, joined in the disturbance, and staff have been withdrawn. The perimeter is secure. That was the statement. It's got to be scary. It's got to be absolutely terrifying for the staff. This is probably their worst nightmare, is that they lose the prison. just have to see what happens now. If it's if it's organised, this could be an escape attempt. But also, it does look like it was just for the conditions. So again, going back between 2 and 5 p.m., approximately 800 prisoners had surrendered. So you've got to remember that a lot of prisoners are just seeing out their sentence. There would have been a lot of prisoners in there who were a month away from getting out, and they didn't need 10 years adding on to their sentence by running up on the roof. And that's a lot of the jails that I've been in at the moment. So when I was it was about 2005, I was looking at my life sentence, and I was in HMP Exeter. And it was part of the overcrowding crisis we had at the time. Now, it's not got that much better now. But at that point, I know when I was going off to courts and things, they would say that there was about 30 places across the whole prison estate in the country, and basically police cells were being used. So I would go off to court, and then because you're supposed to take all your kit with you just in case you get out, but I knew I wasn't getting out. So I basically would leave all my stuff in my cell. I would go to court, and then the prison wouldn't let me back in because they would say there was no spaces, even though my cell was still there, my bed was still there, because technically I was a new prisoner coming in. So they would leave me in a police cell for a day or two. And sometimes you'd be there for several days until a space came up. I was in there with a Manchester lad, funnily enough, at the time, and he said that this prison needs a good riot because it was hot. We were only getting about an hour a day out of our cell. He was looking at quite a long time for a gun offence. I was looking at life, and with the pair of us sat there and was just like, yeah, I'd go on the roof. But there aren't enough prisoners in there at the time, so there weren't enough ACATs, there weren't enough lifers, there weren't enough people who didn't have anything to lose. Most people in Exeter are either waiting to be sentenced for quite a short time, or they're waiting to go off and do the rest of their sentence somewhere else, or they're waiting for trial or things like that. So it wasn't the same conditions. There are only about 600 of us in Exeter, and like I say, most people are on quite short time. So there was never the appetite for a good riot, but it was starting to bubble that way when the occupancy was at its highest. 800 prisoners had surrendered by 5 p.m. and arrangements were being made for them to be transferred to other prisons. At 8 p.m., the governor agreed that the prison officers should enter E-Wing, and at 8:05, approximately 10 control and restraint officers. So they're basically the guys in the riot gear. So they've been properly trained to bash people up. So they've got the shields, the batons, the helmets, that sort of thing. 10 control and restraint units consisting of 12 prison officers entered the wing. So that's 120 officers trying to take down a couple of hundred inmates. This was reported to 8:10, 4 of the landings on E-Wing had been secured, and 1 CNR unit progressed to the centre where they fought with rioting prisoners. This was reported to O'Friel, the governor, who instructed the officers not to move beyond E-Wing. So in the centre, they'd actually got scaffolding set up. So in the middle of this cartwheel that I talked about at the beginning, the offices where you can look down each wing, they'd actually got scaffolding up so that they could do some building work. And obviously the rioting prisoners got hold of the scaffolding, the connectors, all the poles, everything. Scaffolding and other poles and missiles were being thrown at the officers from the roof area of the 4th landing in E-Wing. When prisoners broke onto the wing, the CNR teams withdrew at just after midnight on April the 2nd, leaving the prisoners back in control of the wing. Up to 1,100 of the 1,600 prisoners were involved in the rioting. And by the end of the first day, 700 had surrendered and been transferred, along with 400 prisoners who were not involved in the rioting. Between 200 and 350 prisoners occupied the rooftop of the main prison during the night. At 7 a.m. on the 2nd, an estimated total of 142 prisoners were still in control of the accommodation wings of the prison. Some prisoners on the roof gave clenched fist salutes to the crowd watching below. Some prisoners were wearing prison officers' hats and uniforms, while others were wearing masks improvised from towels and blankets. A banner was unveiled that read "No Dead" in response to press claims that there had been 11 some press had claimed that there had been 11 casualties. Others had said that there was 20 prisoners had been killed in the rioting. So I remember watching a documentary, and the inmates actually just went round themselves when they saw the news reports, and they were saying, what's happened? Has there been any hangings? Has there been any deaths? And obviously people had dished out beatings, but there had been no deaths. So the inmates just wanted people to know that there had been no deaths, and they started putting banners on the roof saying no deaths. And it turned out that only one inmate died from the whole protest anyway, so they were right. And once again, the press was just full of shit. At 10 a.m., the control and restraint units entered the remand prison and regained control, with 6 prisoners surrendering peacefully. A Home Office statement was released at 11:45 a.m. stating that no bodies had been found in the remand prison, and 12 prison officers and 37 prisoners had received treatment in hospital to that date. The further prisoners surrendered the same day, and by 6 p.m., 114 prisoners remained in the prison. So it had gone down from sort of 350 down to about 114. Now, this is pretty typical amongst anything. The longer you leave it, the more people are going to be less interested. They've got that initial buzz of smashing up the prison, and now the reality's set in as there's no food, there's no water. You got rioting outlaws running shit, and it's not as fun as it was when it first started. On April 3rd, so 3 days in now, newspapers published pictures of the prisoners, no dead banner, while still insisting that 20 prisoners had been killed. The prisoners responded with a banner that read, "Media contact now." The good old Manchester Evening News newspaper was contacted from inside the prison by a telephone, and prisoners outlined their demands. Their demands basically were improved visiting facilities, including the right to physical contact with visitors and a children's play area. They wanted Category A prisoners would be allowed to wear their own clothes and be able to receive food parcels, longer exercise periods, and an end to 23-hour-a-day lockup. Now, food parcels seems like a weird one, but if you look back in prison history, you used to be able to, on a visit, have a Sunday lunch and a bottle of beer way back. So it wasn't unusual that food could be brought in from the outside, back in the day. To have food parcels delivered is just difficult because it's just a security risk. Because obviously, inmates just mostly want to get off their face and take drugs. So as the minute you start getting food brought in, you're just going to have it all tainted, and there'll be roofie in their own cereals and stuff. So at 11:10 a.m., Michael Unger from the Evening News was allowed into the prison as an independent observer. Unger met prisoners who described their grievances to him, which included mental, physical abuse, and poor food and conditions, and misuse of drugs in controlling prisoners. So that liquid cosh, basically. While the reporter was inside the prison, 12 CNR units attempted to regain control of E-Wing in what became known as the Battle for E-Wing. Prisoners built barricades and threw scaffolding poles at the officers, and after approximately 30 minutes, the officers withdrew without regaining control of the wing. By the end of the third day, prisoners still controlled the upper levels to the prison, but prison officers had regained control of the lower levels. On April 4th, the governor spoke to the press for the first time, describing the riots as an explosion of evil, which was quite terrible to see. Also that day, the Prison Officers Association claimed that nonce prisoners were being treated in North Manchester General Hospital for castration wounds, which was being repeated by sections of the press, despite being categorically denied by the hospital's public relations officer in charge. 29 prisoners surrendered during the day, leaving 26 prisoners inside the prison, 11 of whom had been identified by the prison service. Also, that a prison officer had died in hospital from pneumonia. He had not been injured during the riot and suffered from a long-standing medical condition. So I don't know how much you can say that was to do with it. People die of pneumonia all the time. On April the 5th, 2 more prisoners surrendered. So we're 5 days in, and we've gone down to, how many did they say? They said there was 29. No, it was 29 prisoners surrendered, leaving 11 of whom. So leaving 26 prisoners inside the prison. So we're down to 26 now. We're down to a classroom full of prisoners holding the prison after 5 days. So you can really see who's got the bottle and who hasn't. So these prisoners are going to be the hardcore. So 2 more prisoners surrendered on April the 5th, the same day as the Home Office announced a public inquiry into the riot headed by Lord Wolfe. By this time, plans to retake the entire prison by force had been scrapped due to the likelihood of fatalities among the prisoners or prison officers, because they've tried to retake the wing 3 times now, and they've just been hit by scaffolding poles and all sorts of makeshift weapons. So, yeah, it's just not worth it. In 5 days, you've lost 90% of the people who were rioting. So why not just wait it out another week? And they'll probably all quit. So this is when they started to use, that evening, they started to use new tactics described to weaken the resolve of prisoners and prevent them from sleeping. So loud music was played, lights were shone at the roof, prison officers began banging on their riot shields and shouted at the prisoners, including calling them beasts, a term normally used for sex offenders. So they want to get in their emotions, they want to get them wound up. I've also heard reports of female officers going up there and basically just messing with their heads, telling them that they love them and they want them to come down and things like this. There wasn't many female officers in Strangeways because it was, again, old school prison. They felt like women had no place in a male prison. But actually the governor who was in charge at this time had thought that with female officers, it adds a new dynamic to the discipline. So sometimes when the tensions are high on the wing, a bunch of hot-headed male officers doesn't make it any better. But put a bunch of female officers on the wing, and suddenly some of the men are going to respond better to a female officer, maybe just telling to try and calm things down, than possibly a male officer. So, going back to the rooftop protest was watched by a crowd of onlookers and supporters outside the prison. Various political groups also attended in support of the prisoners, including an anarchist group, Class War, a communist group, the PLA, and others. On April the 6th, Paul Taylor attempted to shout out the prisoners' demands to the crowd gathered below, but he was drowned out by police sirens. Taylor and other prisoners responded by unfurling a banner which read, "We fight and stand firm on behalf of humanity." On April the 9th, the Sun newspaper called for an end to the riot, saying, "Jail riot scum must be crushed." Former prisoner John McVicker called for the retaking of the prison by force at the earliest opportunity. By April 10, more prisoners had surrendered, leaving 13 inside the prison. So after 10 days, we've gone from hundreds to just the hardcore 13. 3 more prisoners surrendered the following day, one of whom, Barry Morton, had taken part in the rooftop protest on the 26th of March. On the 16th of April, another 3 prisoners surrendered when they became ill with food poisoning. So again, they did manage to get into the kitchens, and they found sort of steaks and pork chops and things that had been there for the staff, obviously, like they didn't receive that. So they basically just made fires, cooked them up on metal trays with a bit of oil, and that was their food. They were having like barbecues basically on a roof of the prison. Some had come ill with food poisoning. Local businesses were calling for an end to the riot due to the disruption caused, including the closure of roads around the prison. A leather jacket retailer in the vicinity of the prison claimed to have lost $20,000 in revenue since the riot had begun. Greater Manchester Police asked for $2 million to cover the cost of policing the riot, which it described as the most savage incident of its kind ever experienced within the British prison service. On the 17th of April, the remaining 7 prisoners began negotiations to attempt to bring the rooftop process to an end. Negotiations took place inside the prison between 2 Home Office officials and a prisoner, Alan Lord, who was negotiating on behalf of the remaining prisoners. April 23rd, so 23 days into this now, Lord was captured by officers in the unit on the way to meet his negotiators. Basically they tricked him. He'd been doing the negotiations, and negotiations were pretty safe. He just went into a room. The officers went into a room. They would talk it out, and then they would leave. But this time they tricked him. They called him down, and they bagged and tagged him. Following the capture of Lord, the remaining prisoners agreed that April 25th would be their final day of the process. Prison officers entered the prison early that morning and gradually began to occupy the upper landings. At 10:20, one of the remaining prisoners, a 17-year-old on remand for joyriding, was captured, leaving 5 prisoners on the roof. When the prison officers reached the roof, they put up a sign similar to the ones used by prisoners throughout the process, which which read, "HMP in charge, no visits." At 6:20 p.m., the remaining 5 prisoners were removed from the roof in a cherry picker, giving clenched fist salutes to the press and public as they descended. During the course of the 25-day riot, the longest in British history, 147 prison officers and 47 inmates had been injured. So yeah, you often see maybe 1 or 2 prisoners staging protests normally. To have one of this size is huge. I know Charles Bronson has been in a few, so it's not impossible to get up onto the roof. It's just normally not done. It's not normally what they do because chaos descends quite quickly, and everyone who organised it, all the boys that got kind of involved, and some of the hardcore last ones, they all got 10 years added to their sentence. That lad that was in for joyriding, he would have been only doing 6 months, 3 years maybe, and he'd be looking at quite a long time. So it was a nutty old time. I don't know if there's anybody out there that remembers the riots, but it was I vaguely remember it. I would have been about 8 when it happened. So it's just one of those things that kind of sticks in my memory. But it's just one of those things that kind of you don't know the details of it until you kind of look into it. So some of the notable inmates that have been at HMP Manchester, we've got Jerry Barton, the footballer, jailed for the assault he did on people. I'm sure he put a cigar out in someone's eye. He was a right little lunatic. Ian Brady was there. He was held there for theft before all the Moors murders and things. Let's have a look. Mark Bridger, a paedophile who was abducted and murdered a 5-year-old girl. He was at Strangeways on remand and then moved to Wakefield. Let's have a look. Charles Bronson was there, a criminal who has been referred to in the press as the most violent prisoner in Britain and Britain's most notorious prisoner. Ian Brown, he was there for a little bit. Who else have we got? Thomas Cashman. Yeah, he was that little idiot who shot dead a girl, didn't he? Running around chasing after a drug dealer. He was there for a bit. One of the suffragettes, Emily Davison, sentenced to a month's hard labour in 1909 after throwing rocks at the Chancellor, David George. She blockaded herself in a cell and sued Strangeways for using a water cannon. Let's have a look. There's obviously a few more in there, but they're all nonsense and other people. Harold Shipman was there. Serial killer was held there on remand while awaiting trial. So yeah, really interesting prison. And one obviously noted in its most famous time was the riot. So thank you very much for obviously listening and listening this far. I'm recording this at work again, and I was only interrupted once by customers today. One customer, one phone call. So it's yeah. I really need to start doing these at home, but I just don't have the time or the energy. And I'm sorry again to the people who are listening this far. I'm really sorry that they're not been as regular as they should be. But life is trying to find a work and life balance, and then trying to find time to do podcasts and find interesting things as well. Because not only does it take a little bit of time to record and edit, but it also takes a little bit of time to research these things. So thank you very much for listening. Please join me again next time when we'll be having a look at prison experiments on Wednesday or Thursday. And hopefully we'll do some more true crime soon as well. Okay, so subscribe, tell all your friends about it. It's the William Bonney podcast. Thank you very much. Cheers now. Bye-bye.